Good morning, y'all. It's Friday, the 24th, and so we're going to read chapters 14 and 15 today in The Boy in Striped Pajamas. So if you want to turn to page 150, you can read along with me. This is Bruno Tells a Perfectly Reasonable Lie. For several weeks after this, Bruno continued to leave the house whenever Litz had gone home for the day and Mother was having one of her afternoon naps, and made a long trek along the fence to meet Shmuel, who almost every afternoon was waiting there for him, sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at the dust beneath him. One afternoon, Shmuel had a black eye, and when Bruno asked him about it, he just shook his head and said he didn't want to talk about it. Bruno assumed that there were bullies all over the world, not just in the schools in Berlin, and that one of them had done this to Shmuel. He felt an urge to help his friend, but he couldn't think of anything he could do to make it better, and he could tell that Shmuel wanted to pretend that it never happened. Every day, Bruno asked Shmuel whether he would be allowed to crawl underneath the wire so that he could play together on the other side of the fence, but every day Shmuel said no, it wasn't a good idea. I don't know why you're so anxious to come across here anyway, said Shmuel. It's not very nice. You haven't tried living in my house, said Bruno. For one thing, it doesn't have 5 floors, only 3. How can anyone live in so small a space as that? He'd forgotten Shmuel's story about the 11 people all living in the same room together before they had come to Outwith, including the boy Luca, who had kept hitting him when he did nothing wrong. One day, Bruno asked why Shmuel and all the other people on that side of the fence wore the same striped pajamas and cloth caps. That's what they gave us when we got here, explained Shmuel. They took away our other clothes. But don't you ever wake up in the morning and feel like wearing something different? There must be something else in your wardrobe. Shmuel blinked and opened his mouth to say something, but then thought better of it. I don't even like stripes, said Bruno, although this wasn't exactly true. In fact, he did like stripes, and he felt increasingly fed up that he had to wear trousers and shirts and ties and the shoes that were too tight for him when Shmuel and his friends got to wear striped pajamas all day long. A few days later, Bruno woke up, and for the first time in weeks, it was raining heavily. It had started at some point during the night, and Bruno even thought that it might have woken him up. But it was hard to tell because once he was awake, there was no way of knowing how that had happened. As he ate his breakfast that morning, the rain continued. Through all the morning classes with Erlitz, and the rain continued. While he ate his lunch, the rain continued. And while they finished another session of history and geography in the afternoon, the rain continued. This was bad news, for it meant that he wouldn't be able to leave the house and meet Shmuel. That afternoon, Bruno lay on his bed with a book, but found it hard to concentrate, and just then the hopeless case came in to see him. She didn't often come into Bruno's room, preferring to arrange and rearrange her collection of dolls constantly during her free time. However, something about the wet weather had put off her game, and she couldn't face playing it again just yet. What do you want? Asked Bruno. That's a nice welcome, said Gretel. I'm reading, said Bruno. What are you reading? She asked him, and rather than answer, he simply turned the cover towards her so that she could see for herself. She made a raspberry sound through her lips, and some of her spit landed on Bruno's face. Boring, she said in a sing-song voice. It's not boring at all, said Bruno. It's an adventure. It's better than dolls, that's for sure. Gretel didn't rise to the bait on that one. What are you doing? She repeated, irritating Bruno even further. I told you I'm trying to read, he said in a grumpy voice. If some people would just let me. I've got nothing to do, she replied. I hate the rain. Bruno found this hard to understand. It wasn't as if she ever did anything anyway. Unlike him, who had adventures and explored places and had made a friend, she rarely left the house at all. It was as if she had decided to be bored simply because on this occasion she didn't have a choice about staying inside. But still, there are moments when a brother and sister can lay down their instruments of torture for a moment and speak as civilized human beings, and Bruno decided to make this one of those moments. I hate the rain too, he said. I should be with Shmuel by now. He'll think I've forgotten him. The words were out of his mouth quicker than he could stop them, and he felt a pain in his stomach and grew furious with himself for saying that. You should be with who? Asked Gretel. What's that? Asked Bruno, blinking back at her. Who did you say you should be with? She asked again. I'm sorry, said Bruno, trying to think quickly. I didn't quite hear you. Could you say that again? Who did you say you should be with? She shouted, leaning forward so that there could be no mistake this time. I never said I should be with anyone, he said. Yes, you did. You said that someone will think you've forgotten them. Pardon? Bruno, she said in a threatening voice, are you mad? He asked, trying to make her think she had entirely made it up, only he wasn't very convincing, for he wasn't a natural actor like grandmother, and Gretel shook her head and pointed a finger at him. What did you say, Bruno? She insisted. You said there was someone you should be with. Who was it? Tell me. There's no one around here to play with, is there? Bruno considered the dilemma he was in. On the one hand, his sister and he had one crucial thing in common. They weren't grown-ups. And although he had never bothered to ask her, there was every chance that she was just as lonely as he was at Outwith. After all, back in Berlin, she'd had Hilda and Isabel and Louise to play with, and they may have been annoying girls, but at least they were her friends. Here she had no one at all except her collection of lifeless dolls. Who knew how mad Gretel was after all? Perhaps she thought the dolls were talking to her. But at the same time, there was the undeniable fact that Shmuel was his friend and not hers, and he didn't want to share him. There was only one thing for it, and that was to lie. I have a new friend, he began, a new friend that I go to see every day, and he'll be waiting for me now, but you can't tell anyone. Why not? Because he's an imaginary friend, said Bruno, trying his best to look embarrassed, just like Lieutenant Kotler when he had become trapped in his story about his father in Switzerland. We play together every day. Gretel opened her mouth and stared at him before breaking into a laugh. An imaginary friend, she cried. Aren't you a little old for an imaginary friend? Bruno tried to look ashamed and embarrassed in order to make his story more convincing. He squirmed on the bed and didn't look her in the eye, which worked a treat and made him think that perhaps he wasn't such a bad actor after all. He wished that he could make himself go red, but it was difficult to do that, so he thought of embarrassing things that had happened to him over the years and wondered whether these would do the trick. He thought of the time he had forgotten to lock the bathroom door and grandmother had walked in and seen everything. He thought of the time he had put his hand up in class and called the teacher mother, and everyone had laughed at him. He thought of the time he'd fallen off the bicycle in front of a group of girls when he was trying to do a special trick and cut his knee and cried. One of them worked, and his face started to go red. Look at you, said Gretel, confirming it. You've gone all red. Because I didn't want to tell you, said Bruno. An imaginary friend. Honestly, Bruno, you're a hopeless case. Bruno smiled because he knew two things. The first was that he had gotten away with his lie, and the second was that if anyone was the hopeless case around here, it wasn't him. Leave me alone, he said. I want to read my book. Well, why don't you lie down and close your eyes and let your imaginary friend read it to you, said Gretel, delighted with herself now because she had something on him and she wasn't going to let it drop in a hurry. Save you a job. Maybe I should send him to throw all your dolls out your window, he said. You do, and there'll be trouble, said Gretel, and he knew that she meant it. Well, tell me this, Bruno. What do you and this imaginary friend of yours do together that makes him so special? Bruno thought about it. He realized that he actually wanted to talk about Shmuel a little bit and that this might be a way to do it without having to tell the truth about his existence. We talk about everything, he told her. I tell him about our house back in Berlin and all the other houses in the streets and the fruit and vegetable stalls and the cafes and how you shouldn't go into town on Saturday afternoon unless you want to get pushed from pillar to post, and about Carl and Daniel and Martin and how they were my three best friends for life. How interesting, said Gretel sarcastically, because she had recently had a birthday and turned 13 and thought that sarcasm was the very height of sophistication. And what does he tell you? He tells me about his family and the watch shop that he used to live over and the adventures he had coming here and the friends he used to have and the people he knows here and about the boys he used to play with, but he doesn't anymore because they disappeared without even saying goodbye to him. He sounds like a barrel of laughs, said Gretel. I wish he was my imaginary friend. And yesterday he told me about that his grandfather hasn't been seen for days, and no one knows where he is. And whenever he asks his father about him, he starts crying and hugs him so hard that he's worried he's going to squeeze him to death. Bruno got to the end of this sentence and realized that his voice had gone very quiet. These were the things that Shmuel had told him, but for some reason he hadn't really understood at the time how sad it must have made his friend. When Bruno said them out loud himself, he felt terrible that he hadn't tried to say anything to cheer Shmuel up, and instead had started talking about something silly like exploring. I'll say sorry for that tomorrow, he told himself. If father knew you were talking to imaginary friends, you'd be in for it, said Gretel. I think you should stop. Why? Asked Bruno. Because it's not healthy, she said. It's the first sign of madness. Bruno nodded. I don't think I can stop, he said after a very long pause. I don't think I want to. Well, all the same, said Gretel, who was becoming friendlier and friendlier by the second. I'd keep it to myself if I were you. Well, said Bruno, trying to look sad, you're probably right. You won't tell anyone, will you? She shook her head. No one, except my own imaginary friend. Bruno gasped. Do you have one? He asked, picturing her at another part of the fence talking to a girl her own age, the two of them being sarcastic together for hours at a time. No, she said, laughing. I'm 13 years old, for heaven's sakes. I can't afford to act like a child, even if you can. And with that, she flounced out of the room, and Bruno could hear her talking to her dolls in her room across the hall, scolding them for getting themselves into such a mess while her back was turned that she had no choice but to rearrange them. And did they think she had nothing better to do with her time? Some people, she said loudly before getting down to work. Bruno tried to return to his book, but he'd lost interest in it for now and stared out at the rain instead and wondered whether Shmuel, wherever he was thinking about him too and missing their conversations as much as he was. This is chapter 15, Something He Shouldn't Have Done. For several weeks, the rain was on and off and on and off, and Bruno and Shmuel did not see much of each other as they would have liked. When they did meet, Bruno found that he was starting to worry about his friend because he seemed to be getting even thinner by the day, and his face was growing more and more gray. Sometimes he brought more bread and cheese with him to give to Shmuel, and from time to time he even managed to hide a piece of chocolate cake in his pocket. But the walk from the house to the place in the fence where the two boys met was a long one, and sometimes Bruno got hungry on the way and found that one bite of the cake would lead to another, and that in turn led to another, and by the time there was only one mouthful left, he knew it would be wrong to give that to Shmuel because it would only tease his appetite and not satisfy it. Father's birthday was coming up soon, and although he said he didn't want a fuss, Mother arranged a party for all the officers serving at Outwith, and with a great fuss was made to prepare for it. Every time she sat down to make more plans for the party, Lieutenant Kotler was there beside her to help, and between them they seemed to be making more lists than they could ever possibly be needed. Bruno decided to make a list of his own, a list of all the reasons why he didn't like Lieutenant Kotler. There was the fact that he never smiled and always looked as if he was trying to find somebody to cut out of his will. On the rare occasion when he spoke to Bruno, he addressed him as little man, which was just plain nasty, because as Mother pointed out, he just hadn't had his growth spurt yet. Not to mention the fact that he was always in the living room with Mother and making jokes with her, and Mother laughed at his jokes more than she laughed at Father's. And once when Bruno was watching the camp from his bedroom window, he saw a dog approach the fence and start barking loudly, and when Lieutenant Kotler heard it, he marched right over to the dog and shot it. Then there was all that nonsense that Gretel came out with whenever he was around. And Bruno still hadn't forgotten the evening with Paddle, the waiter who was really a doctor, and how angry the young lieutenant had been. Also, whenever Father was called away to Berlin on an overnight trip, the lieutenant hung around the house as if he were in charge. He would be there when Bruno was going to bed and be back again in the morning after he even woke up. or before he even woke up. There were a lot more reasons why Bruno didn't like Lieutenant Cutler, but these were the first things that came to his mind. On the afternoon before the birthday party, Bruno was in his room with the door open when he heard Lieutenant Cutler arriving at the house and speaking to someone, although he couldn't hear anyone answering back. A few minutes later, as he was coming downstairs, he heard Mother giving instructions about what needed to be done, and Lieutenant Cutler saying, "Don't worry, this one knows which side his bread is buttered on," then laughing in a nasty way. Bruno walked toward the living room with a new book Father had given him called Treasure Island, intending to sit in there for an hour or two while he read it. But as he walked through the hallway, he ran into Lieutenant Cutler, who was just leaving the kitchen. "Hello, little man," the soldier said, sneering at him as usual. "Hello," said Bruno, frowning. "What are you up to then?" Bruno stared at him and started thinking of even more reasons to dislike him. "I'm going in there to read my book," he said, pointing toward the living room. Without a word, Cutler whipped the book out of Bruno's hands and started to flick through it. "Treasure Island," he said. "What's it about then?" "Well, there's an island," said Bruno slowly, to make sure that the soldier could keep up, "and there's a treasure on it." "I could have guessed that," said Cotler, looking at him as if there were things he would do to the boy if he were a son of his and not the son of the commandant. "Tell me something I don't know about it." "There's a pirate in it," said Bruno, "called Long John Silver, and a boy called Jim Hawkins." "An English boy?" asked Cotler. "Yes," said Bruno. "Grunt," grunted Cotler. Bruno stared at him and wondered how long it would be before he gave back his book. He didn't seem particularly interested in it, but when Bruno reached for it, he pulled away. "Sorry," he said, holding it out again, and for when Bruno reached for it, he pulled it away for the second time. "Oh, I'm sorry," he repeated, and held it out once more, and this time Bruno swiped it out of his hand quicker than he could pull it away. "Aren't you quick?" muttered Lieutenant Cotler between his teeth. Bruno tried to step past him, but for some reason Lieutenant Cotler seemed to want to talk to him today. "All set for the party, are we?" he asked. "Well, I am," said Bruno, who had been spending more time with Gretel lately and had developed a liking for sarcasm. "I can't speak for you." "There'll be a lot of people here," said Lieutenant Cotler, breathing in heavily and looking around as if this were his house and not Bruno's. "We'll be on our best behavior, won't we?" "Well, I'll be," said Bruno. "I can't speak for you." "You have a lot to say for such a little man," said Lieutenant Cotler. Bruno narrowed his eyes and wished he were taller, stronger, and 8 years older. A ball of anger exploded inside him and made him wish that he had the courage to say exactly what he wanted to say. It was one thing, he decided, to be told what to do by Mother and Father. That was perfectly reasonable and to be expected. But it was another thing entirely to be told what to do by someone else, even someone with a fancy title like lieutenant. "Oh, Kurt, precious, you're still here," said Mother, stepping out of the kitchen and coming towards them. "I have a little free time now, if—" "Oh," she said, noticing Bruno standing there. "Bruno, what are you doing here?" "I was going into the living room to read my book," said Bruno, "or I was trying to at least." "Well, run along into the kitchen for the moment," she said. "I need a private word with Lieutenant Cotler." As they stepped into the living room together, as, as Lieutenant Cotler closed the doors in Bruno's face. Seething with anger, Bruno went into the kitchen and got the biggest surprise of his life. There, sitting at the table, a long way from the other side of the fence, was Shmuel. Bruno could barely believe his eyes. "Shmuel," he said, "what are you doing here?" Shmuel looked up, and his terrified face broke into a broad smile as he saw his friend standing there. "Bruno," he said. "What are you doing here?" repeated Bruno, for although he still didn't quite understand what took place on the other side of the fence, there was something about the people from there that made him think they shouldn't be here in this house, in his house. "He brought me," said Shmuel. "He?" asked Bruno. "You don't mean Lieutenant Cotler?" "Yes, he said there was a job for me to do here." And when Bruno looked down, he saw 64 small glasses, the ones Mother used when she was having one of her medicinal sherries, sitting on the kitchen table, and beside them a bowl of warm soapy water and lots of paper napkins. "What on earth are you doing?" asked Bruno. "They asked me to polish the glasses," said Shmuel. "They said they needed someone with tiny fingers." As if to prove something to Bruno already knew, he held his hand out, and Bruno couldn't help but notice it was like the hand of a pretend skeleton that Herr Litz had brought with him one day when they were studying human anatomy. I'd never noticed before, he said in a disbelieving voice, almost to himself. Never noticed what? Asked Shmuel. In reply, Bruno held his own hand out so that the tips of their middle fingers were almost touching. Our hands, he said. They're so different. Look. The two boys looked down at the same time, and the difference was easy to see. Although Bruno was small for his age and certainly not fat, his hand appeared healthy and full of life. The veins weren't visible through the skin, and the fingers weren't little more than dying twigs. Shmuel's hands, however, told a very different story. How did it get like that? He asked. I don't know, said Shmuel. It used to look more like yours, but I didn't notice it changing. Everyone on my side of the fence looks like this now. Bruno frowned. He thought about the people in their stupid pajamas, or in their striped pajamas, and wondered what was going on at Outwith and whether it wasn't a very bad idea if it made people look so unhealthy. None of it made any sense to him. Not wanting to look at Shmuel's hand any longer, Bruno turned around and opened the refrigerator, rooting about inside it for something to eat. There was half a stuffed chicken left over from lunchtime, and Bruno's eyes sparkled in delight, for there were very few things in life that he enjoyed more than cold chicken with sage and onion stuffing. He took a knife from the drawer and cut himself a few healthy slices and coated them with the stuffing before turning back to his friend. I'm very glad you're here, he said, speaking with his mouth full. If only you didn't have to polish the glasses, I could show you my room. He told me not to move from this seat or there'd be trouble. I wouldn't mind him, said Bruno, trying to sound braver than he really was. This isn't his house, it's mine. And when father's away, I'm in charge. Can you believe he's never even read Treasure Island? Shmuel looked as if he wasn't really listening. Instead, his eyes were focused on the slices of chicken and stuffing that Bruno was throwing casually into his mouth. After a moment, Bruno realized what he was looking at and immediately felt guilty. I'm sorry, Shmuel, he said quickly. I should have given you some chicken too. Are you hungry? That's a question you never have to ask me, said Shmuel, who, although he had never met Gretel in his life, knew something about sarcasm too. Wait there, I'll cut some off for you, said Bruno, opening the fridge and cutting another 3 healthy slices. No, if he comes back, said Shmuel, shaking his head quickly and looking back and forth towards the door. If who comes back? You don't mean Lieutenant Kotler. I'm just supposed to be cleaning the glasses, he said, looking at the bowl of water in front of him in despair, and then looking back at the slices of chicken that Bruno held out to him. He's not going to mind, said Bruno, who was confused by how anxious Shmuel seemed. It's only food. I can't, said Shmuel, shaking his head and looking as if he was going to cry. He'll come back. I know he will. He continued, his sentences running quickly together. I should have eaten them when you offered them, and now it's too late. If I take them, he'll come in and Shmuel, here, said Bruno, stepping forward and putting the slices in his friend's hand. Just eat them. There's lots left for our tea. You don't have to worry about that. The boy stared at the food in his hand for a moment, then looked up at Bruno with wide and grateful but terrified eyes. He threw one more glance in the direction of the door and then seemed to make a decision because he thrust all 3 slices in his mouth in one go and gobbled them down in 20 seconds flat. Well, you don't have to eat them all so quickly, said Bruno. You'll make yourself sick. I don't care, said Shmuel, giving a faint smile. Thank you, Bruno. Bruno smiled back, and he was about to offer him some more food, but just at that moment, Lieutenant Kotler reappeared in the kitchen and stopped when he saw the two boys talking. Bruno stared at him, feeling the atmosphere grow heavy, sensing Shmuel's shoulders sinking down as he reached for another glass and began polishing. Ignoring Bruno, Lieutenant Kotler marched over to Shmuel and glared at him. What are you doing? He shouted. Didn't I tell you to polish those glasses? Shmuel nodded his head quickly and started to tremble a little as he picked up another napkin and dipped it in the water. Who told you that you were allowed to talk in this house? Continued Kotler. Do you dare to disobey me? No, sir, said Shmuel quietly. I'm sorry, sir. He looked up at Lieutenant Kotler, who frowned, leaning forward slightly, tilting his head as he examined the boy's face. Have you been eating? He asked him in a quiet voice as if he could scarcely believe it himself. Shmuel shook his head. You have been eating, insisted Lieutenant Cutler. Did you steal something from that fridge? Shmuel opened his mouth and closed it. He opened it again and tried to find the words, that there were none. He looked towards Bruno, his eyes pleading for help. Answer me, shouted Lieutenant Cutler. Did you steal something from that fridge? No, sir, he gave it to me, said Shmuel, tears welling up in his eyes as he threw a sideways glance at Bruno. He's my friend, he added. Began Lieutenant Cutler, looking across at Bruno in confusion. He hesitated. What do you mean, your friend? He asked. Do you know this boy, Bruno? Bruno's mouth dropped open, and he tried to remember the way you used your mouth if you wanted to say the word yes. He'd never seen anyone look so terrified as Shmuel did at that moment, and he wanted to say the right thing to make things better. But when he realized that he couldn't because he was feeling just as terrified himself. Do you know this boy? Repeated Kotler in a louder voice. Have you been talking to the prisoners? He was here when I came in, said Bruno. He was cleaning glasses. That's not what I asked you, said Kotler. Have you seen him before? Have you talked to him? Why does he say you're his friend? Bruno wished he could run away. He hated Lieutenant Kotler, but he was advancing on him now, and all Bruno could think of was the afternoon when he had seen him shooting a dog and the evening when Pavel had made him so angry that he, Tell me, Bruno, shouted Kotler, his face growing red. I won't ask you a third time. I've never spoken to him, said Bruno immediately. I've never seen him before in my life. I don't know him. Lieutenant Kotler nodded and seemed satisfied with the answer. Very slowly, he turned his head back to look at Shmuel, who wasn't crying anymore, merely staring at the floor and looking as if he was trying to convince his soul not to live inside his tiny body anymore, but to slip away and sail to the door and rise up to the sky, gliding through the clouds until it was very far away. You will finish polishing all these glasses, said Lieutenant Kotler in a very quiet voice now, so quiet that Bruno almost couldn't hear him. It was as if all his anger had just changed into something else, not quite the opposite, but something unexpected and dreadful. And then I will come to collect you and bring you back to the camp, where we will have a discussion about what happens to boys who steal. This is understood, yes? Shmuel nodded and picked up another napkin and started to polish another glass. Bruno watched as his fingers shook and knew that he was terrified of breaking one. His heart sank, but as much as he wanted to, he couldn't look away. Come on, little man, said Lieutenant Kotler, coming towards Bruno now and putting an unfriendly arm around his shoulder. You go to the living room and read your book and leave this little to finish his work. He used the same word he had used to Pavel when he had sent him to find the tire. Bruno nodded and turned around and left the kitchen without looking back. His stomach churned inside him, and he thought for a moment that he was going to be sick. He had never felt so ashamed in his life. He had never imagined that he could behave so cruelly, and he wondered how a boy who thought he was a good person really could act in such a cowardly way towards a friend. He sat in the living room for several hours, but couldn't concentrate on his book and didn't dare go back to the kitchen until later that evening, when Lieutenant Kotler had already come back and collected Shmuel and taken him away again. Every afternoon that followed, Bruno returned to the place in the fence where they met, but Shmuel was never there. After almost a week, he was convinced that what he had done was so terrible that he would never be forgiven. But on the seventh day, he was delighted to see that Shmuel was waiting for him, sitting cross-legged on the ground as usual and staring at the dust beneath him. Shmuel, he said, running towards him and sitting down, almost crying with relief and regret. I'm so sorry, Shmuel. I don't know why I did it. Say you'll forgive me. It's all right, said Shmuel, looking up at him now. There was a lot of bruising on his face, and Bruno grimaced, and after a moment he forgot about his apology. What happened to you? He asked, and then didn't wait for an answer. Was it your bicycle? Because that happened to me back in Berlin a couple years ago. I fell off when I was going too fast and was black and blue for weeks. Does it hurt? I don't feel it anymore, said Shmuel. It looks like it hurts. I don't feel anything anymore, said Shmuel. Well, I am sorry about last week, said Bruno. I hate that Lieutenant Kotler. He thinks he's in charge, but he isn't. He hesitated for a moment, not wanting to get sidetracked. He felt that he should say it one last time and really mean it. I'm very sorry, Shmuel, he said in a clear voice. I can't believe I didn't tell him the truth. I've never let a friend down like that before, Shmuel. I'm ashamed of myself. And when he said that, Shmuel smiled and nodded, and Bruno knew that he was forgiven. And then Shmuel did something that he had never done before. He lifted the bottom of the fence up like he did whenever Bruno brought him food. But this time, he reached his hand out and held it there, waiting until Bruno did the same. And the two boys shook hands and smiled at each other. It was the first time they had ever touched. And that is the end of our reading for today. So on Monday, we will start reading on page 176, the haircut. And I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. I hope the weather is nice and you get to go out and enjoy the sunshine and enjoy your few days without schoolwork. So enjoy your family, enjoy the weather, and I will be back on Monday.